remembrances of Shutapadi, who in one of the edited volumes for News India had contributed an article on Rabindranath. So I will begin by paying my respects to her. And as Sangyuktabi and the others have pointed out, that for Tagore, passing away was just the initiation of another journey. And therefore, my talk today will look at the ways in which Tagore came to terms with illness and convalescence. We must remember that, again, as Sangyuktabi pointed out, Tagore encountered numerous deaths in his lifetime, deaths to very close relatives, daughters, children, of course, his associates. But at the same time, he was writing at a period when India was facing severe diseases, including malaria, the Spanish flu, and so on and so forth. But I've spoken elsewhere about this, but it is Tagore among the major authors who poets who talks about disease and convalescence in a very detailed way in two very seminal collections of his poems, Rogshujjay and Arugula. And today I'm going to take a look at how a poet like Tagore looks at illness, diseased states, and the issue of convalescence. Just one query, is the PowerPoint visible here?
Yes.
Right, thank you. Now, that, of course, is taken from one of the last pictures of Tagore taken at Shantiniketan. But I'd like to begin with not Tagore, but somebody whom we've all read in different contexts, who was equally, affected by illness, nervous breakdowns during her lifetime, Virginia Woolf, and a very short essay titled On Being Ill, which was written in 1925 and published in the New Criterion in 1926. And Woolf raises a very interesting question. She asks, considering how common illness is, it becomes strange indeed that illness has not taken its place with love, battle, and jealousy among prime themes of literature. We have today a galaxy of poets within us, and many of you will probably agree how illness does not become a subject of the literary in many ways. And Woolf also makes another very interesting suggestion, that illness and the depiction of it requires a kind of a new language. And she talks about the poverty of language in depicting illness, as it were. A new language, she says, we need that primitive, subtle, sensual, obscene, and a new hierarchy of the passions. The third thing, just to remind you that among the major painters also, it's probably Munch who's painted himself in a state of illness. Illness doesn't become a theme of painting either. Now, the third thing that Woolf makes or points out is the state of childishness and an outspokenness that illness provokes within us. Truths which are blurted out, which the cautious respectability of health conceals, and a degree of, lonely speak, as it were. Another feature, which this very, very interesting essay of Woolf, which I keep on reading nowadays, is that in disease, we look at things which are very small and close and familiar, and which are very important in their indifference. And Woolf suggests that illness should become, or should be, part and parcel of the literary canon, as it were, and that poetry is more suited to depicting the state rather than prose. So it is with this kind of a very short introduction by one of the most sensitive of essayists, that I would like to look at Rabindranath's poetry and his ideas about the state of illness, or the state of representing subjectively the state of disease. Now, we must also remember that Rogsojja and Arugula were written right at the end of Rabindranath's career. I failed to locate any major literary reference to his state of depression which he underwent when he was in England. But these were some of his last writings. 1940, he collapses at Mongpu, and the prostate infection flares up, carried to Kolkata, where he writes a large body of poems of the Rogsojja poems, which is the disease. And then at Shantiniketan, he comes back and writes many of these poems on Arugula or Convalescence. Rabindranath is, of course, at this point of time aware that death is knocking at the door, as it were. Therefore, even the poems of Arugula acknowledge the sort of vast unknown to which he will step forward shortly. Now, the first feature which I look in the Rogsojja poems is this state of powerlessness. And there's an interplay between powerlessness before disease and an assertion of defiance in the certain recurrent poems. So I'm referring to poem number 19, where Rabindranath uses a very interesting metaphor. And this sort of ties up with Woolf's idea of finding a new kind of a language to depict the state of illness, as it were. His body is the broken toy once manufactured in the workshops of the creator. Now, unfortunately, much of it is lost in translation. So I'll read out just a few lines of the Bengali original. এটা 19 নম্বর কবিতা। রবীন্দ্রনাথ লিখছেন, সজীব খেলনা যদি গড়া হয় বিধাতার কর্মশালে, কি তাহার দশা হয় তাই করি অনুভব আজি আয়ু শেষে। Reduced to the sickbed, Rabindranath sees this as a second childhood, is forced to comprehend the unseen laughter at man's repeated rebellions against, and finally submitting to the lightning-like directives. Now, this is also interesting because Rabindranath seems to move away in illness from the masculine identity to the identity of the child who is submitting once again to the Sheba of much younger women. And it is here that you see in illness, the masculine vanity of the poet and his other sort of manifestations of patriarchy, Rabindranath says, of the individual sort of disappear. So illness, or the state of illness, is also given a kind of a gendered identity. Now, poem number 15 onwards, there's despair at the diseased body once again. I'm not going to read out the texts, but there are references to the Bhagna Dasha, there are references to Jora, Ayushesh, and so on and so forth. And he turns, as he was always apt to do, to the morning sun for strength and regeneration. I can almost sort of visualizing him in the Jora Shakur Thakurbari looking at the east. Now, in poem number 11, and through these poems of suffering, as it were, comes a philosophical awareness of the cycle of life, as it were. Rabindranath writes, this collapse is the directive of a fullness. His creation will manifest at the end. Crushed will be the defiant day. A new seed will sprout with new life. But in poem number 23, written on the 25th of November, 1950, Rabindranath writes about a new direction, And this is where, the fever has just gone into remission, and a new optimism seems to flood the poems. And he writes, আরোগ্যের পথে যখন পেলেম সদ্য প্রসন্ন প্রাণের নিমন্ত্রণ, দান সে করিল মোরে নূতন চোখের বিশ্ব দেখা। বুঝিলাম এই এক জন্ম মোর নব নব জন্মসূত্রে গাঁথা। The very beautiful poem, song that we have just listened to. You see the reiteration of Pochishe Boishak as a kind of rebirth and almost yearly, daily rebirth that Tagore talks about time and again is manifested in this poem. And also in poem number 24, and this is a poem which touches me time and again, Tagore makes this point that as long as there is life, we cannot give the battle up. And the Bangla, you have the English there on the screen, the Bangla reads like this: রুগ্ন যদি রোগের চরম সত্য বলে, তাহা নিয়ে স্পর্ধা করা লজ্জা বলে জানি, তার চেয়ে বিনা বাক্যে আত্মহত্যা ভালো, মানুষের কবিত্ব হবে শেষ কলঙ্ক ভাজন, অসংস্কৃত যদিচ্ছের পথে চলি, মুখশ্রীর করিব কি প্রতিবাদ, মুখোশের নির্লজ্জ নকল। So the spirit of defiance, the spirit of convalescence, the spirit of indomitable life. In poem number 27, this changes into once again the metaphor of light. And this is also an incredibly dense poem where Rabindranath writes, provided you with the translation, but the Bangla reads so very well. খুলে দাও দ্বার নীলাকাশ করো অবারিত, কৌতূহলী পুষ্পগন্ধ কক্ষে মোর করুক প্রবেশ, প্রথম রৌদ্রের আলো সর্বদেহে হোক সঞ্চারিত, শিরায় শিরায় আমি বেঁচে আছি তারই অভিনন্দনের বাণী, মর্মরিত পল্লবে পল্লবে আমার শুনিয়ে দাও। Zest for life, this desire to live. Now, let me move on from Aruggo to Rogshojjay. I've been given 10 minutes, so I wouldn't like to sort of step beyond my time. Aruggo carries on this in the celebrating the sweetness of life, the dust of the earth, the great machine that fulfills life. And in poem number 9, Rabindranath comes back to a favorite metaphor of his, that is the playhouse of 1,000 forms. বিরাট সৃষ্টির ক্ষেত্রে আতশবাজির খেলা আকাশে আকাশে, দেখিলাম যুগে যুগে নটনটি বহু শত শত, ফেলে গেছে নানা রঙে বেশ তাহাদের রঙ্গশালাদারের বাহিরে, দেখিলাম চাহি শত শত নির্বাপিত নক্ষত্রের নেপথ্য প্রাঙ্গণে নটরাজ নিস্তব্ধ একা। It's an incredible way in which Rabindranath sort of sees this kind of life, its playfulness, and the Nataraj image which has come earlier through a prism of sickness. But there is a sense of pain and anxiety of Rogshojjay which kind of sort of disappears in Aruggo. But then there comes this question as to whether Tagore sees the fret about pain and death as a disease in itself that must be cured by a new triumphant realization of a cycle and life and a presence of a greater being beyond. Now, this in Rogshojjay is sporadic. In Aruggo, this is a consistent theme. And in poem number 32, Rabindranath seems to sort of bring into his poems a new kind of an acceptance where he talks about the veil being removed from this eye. And the Bangla reads like this: আলোকের আলোকের অন্তরে যে আনন্দের পরশন পাই, জানি আমি তার সাথে আমার আত্মার ভেদ নাই, ললাট দিয়েছে জয়লেখ, জানায়েছে অমৃতের আমি অধিকারী, পরম আমির সাথে যুক্ত হতে পারি, বিচিত্র জগতে প্রবেশ লভিতে পারি আনন্দের পথে। Therefore, Rogshojja and Arogyo kind of form a dyad where the conceptualization of disease and death is challenged to a newer and a regenerative idea of a cyclical and a more vital life. This Tanya was always also referring to. But I would like to come to Woolf's point that the inconsequential little details of life become so very important when the poet is writing about in disease. And it's very interesting. Poem number 6 of Rogshojja talks about the chorui pakhi. ওগো আমার ভোরের চড়ুই পাখি, একটুখানি আধার থাকতে বাকি, ঘুম ঘোরের অল্প অবশেষে, শাসির পরে ঠোকর মারো আসে. And then there are 2 lines which I find very interesting. অরণ্যেরই গাহন সভায় যাও না সেলাম ঠুকি, আলোর সাথে গ্রাম্য ভাষায় আলাপ মুখোমুখি. Now, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Grammo bhashaয়. And that continues when Rabindranath writes, অনিদ্রাতে যখন আমার কাটে দুঃখের রাত, আশা করি দ্বারে তোমার প্রথম চঞ্চু ঘাত, অভিক তোমার চটুল তোমার সহজ প্রাণের বাণী, দাও আমারে আনি, সকল জীবের দিনের আলো আমারে লয় ডাকি, ওগো আমার ভোরের চড়ুই পাখি. Now, Rabindranath's bond with nature and animals once again finds its way into another poem. In poem number 11 of Arugula, I'm not going to read the Bangla, but once again, this sense of faithfulness, keeping company with the poet, and the pleasure of the interaction of the is a perennial presence in Rabindranath's poetry. But the one poem which I find outstanding in Arugula is a poem that does not talk about disease at all. And it's a poem which many of us have read, but little do we realize that this belongs to a collection that deals with disease and redemption and convalescence. And this is the poem number 13, where Rabindranath talks about সাম্রাজ্য লোভী পাঠানের দল এসেছে মোগল বিজয় রথের চাকা, শূন্য পথে চাই আজি তার কোনো চিহ্ন নাই. And he writes, this is the translation of the poem, পৃথিবীর মাটির পৃথিবী পরে পানে আঁখি মেলি জবে, দেখি সেথা কল রবে, বিপুল জনতা চলে নানা পথে নানা দলে দলে, যুগ যুগান্তর হতে মানুষের নিত্য প্রয়োজনে জীবনে মরণে, ওরা চিরকাল টানে দাঁড় ধরে থাকে হাল, ওরা মাঠে মাঠে বীজ বনে পাকা ধান কাটে, ওরা কাজ করে নগরে প্রান্তরে, মন্দ্রিত করিয়া তোলে জীবনের মহামন্ত্রধ্বনি, শত শত সাম্রাজ্যের ভগ্ন শেষ পরে ওরা কাজ করে. Sangyutta was just referring, and Sangeeta was also referring to the way in which the greatest tribute to be paid is probably in this poem, where Rabindranath seems to sort of talk about the continuity of life, not merely at an individual scale, but also within the greater mass of humanity, especially in the subaltern, not the entitled few, but the spirit of human labor and endurance that announces eternal health and recovery. As we discussed the pandemic, one of the images that comes back to haunt me is the images of the migrant laborers moving across the length and breadth of India. And as we look at them, that is the lingering image, ora kaj kore, and that is the great mass whom we very often forget. Now, to conclude, I'd just like to say that Arugula and Rogshojja remain poems or collections of poems which have not really been adequately studied. Rabindranath wrote about disease in a large number of his prose tracts. But it's probably here that we see Rabindranath engaging very significantly with a new language and different perspectives on disease as a phenomenon in literature. And it is therefore that this pattern of the suffering body, the insignificant details, the natural creatures and objects, the women who surround him in a state of second childhood, the healing touch of people, including his old servant whom he mentions, the desire for life, the zeal to overcome and not surrender to disease, and linking disease with the greater mass of humanity and an attempt to reach out to the eternal I is manifest. Therefore, I would like to conclude this very short presentation with Rabindranath's poem, the last poem of Arugula. And this I dedicate to the memory of Shrutapadi. And this is a poem which, is probably contains within itself the essence of the two collections. এ আমির আবরণ সহজে স্খলিত হয়ে যাক, চৈতন্যের শুভ্র রাতি ভেদ করি কুহেলিকা, সত্যের অমৃত রূপ করুক প্রকাশ। সর্বমানুষের মাঝে এক চিরমানবের আনন্দ কিরণ, চিত্তে মোর হোক বিকিরিত। সংসারের ক্ষুব্ধতার স্তব্ধ ঊর্ধ্বলোকে নিত্যের যে শান্তিরূপ তাই যেন দেখে যেতে পারি। জীবনের জটিল যা বহু নিরর্থক, মিথ্যার বাহন যাহা সমাজের কৃত্রিম মূল্যেই, তাই দিয়ে কাঙালের অশান্ত জনতা দূরে ঠেলে দিয়ে এ জন্মের সত্য অর্থ স্পষ্ট চোখে জেনে যায় যেন সীমা তার পেরোবার। Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. It was brilliant, and it was somewhere, it was like talking about it or hearing you talk about Rog Shojjai ebong Arogyo. It's somewhere, মনে হয় যেন মনের মধ্যে একটা প্রশান্তি এলো, ঠিক যে প্রশান্তি কবির যে কোনো কাজে আমরা পাই। আর এই এই পুরো কথাগুলো শুনতে শুনতে আমার যেটা বারবার মনে হচ্ছিল একটি গানের কথা, সেটা হচ্ছে আমরা বৈশাখের একদম প্রথমেই এসো হে বৈশাখ বলে যে কথাগুলো বলতে থাকি, আজকে এই এই লেকচারটা বা এই টকটা শুনতে শুনতে আমার মনে হচ্ছিল যে ওই কথাগুলো ভীষণ ইম্পর্ট্যান্ট। মুছে যাক গ্লানি ঘুচে যাক জরা। তো কোথাও এই যে একটা ঘুচে যাওয়ার মুছে যাওয়ার মানে বৈশাখ একটা নতুন কিছু নিয়ে আসবে, সেটা বোধহয় আমরা কবির জন্মদিন উপলক্ষেও সবসময় মনে করতে থাকি।